My wife cheated on me with dozens of men, but her reaction to the video evidence of the affair shocked everyone. I discovered my wife, Emily, getting uncomfortably close with a man on the dance floor. What they were doing could hardly be called dancing. It was clear she had too much to drink. I quickly approached them, pulling her arms from around his neck and began to lead her away.
"What's going on here, man?" snapped the guy she was with.
"I'm her husband and we're leaving," I responded firmly. His initial readiness to challenge me faded instantly. "Take her. She's all yours," he muttered dismissively. "She's no good in bed when she's drunk anyway." As I carried her to my SUV and drove to her parents' house, I could tell she was already out of it, likely gone even before they left the dance floor. Without a word, I laid her on her bed and left the room. My name is Stephen Grant, raised in the small town of Silverwood, Kentucky, by devout Lutheran parents. I have 2 older sisters, Margaret and Sarah Johnson, and 2 younger brothers, Matthew and Daniel Grant. We grew up in poverty, with very limited exposure to the world outside our rural community. Determined not to follow in our parents' footsteps, leaving Silverwood was our goal after high school. Margaret and Matthew moved to Lexington, while Sarah and Daniel stayed in Springfield. College wasn't an option for us, so Margaret found work as a waitress in a local diner, and Matthew faced difficulties, but eventually succeeded as a delivery driver with the help of a mentor who believed in him. Matthew soon secured a job driving for a regional music star, a position usually reserved for more experienced drivers, but he excelled. I managed to earn a 3-year Army ROTC scholarship to the University of Louisville, and upon graduation, I was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. My first assignment took me to Japan with the 9th Army, where I served for 15 months before returning home on a 45-day leave. During that time, I spent some days with my family and stayed in Lexington with Margaret. Matthew was away on tour, but while I stayed with Margaret, I met her friend Laura and Laura's younger brother David. Laura and I began dating, and by the end of my leave, we were in a serious relationship. Fortunately, Fort Knox was not far from Lexington, so we spent a lot of time together. After our 4th date, our relationship grew more intimate, and within a year, we were married. After our time at Fort Knox, we were transferred to Italy, which was a significant change for both of us. Laura quickly adapted by joining social clubs and learning Italian. We traveled across Europe, soaking in the culture. Over time, Laura developed a taste for European wines, a passion I never shared, having been raised in a home where alcohol was never present. Our next assignment brought us back to Fort Knox, which delighted both of us. We settled into military housing and enjoyed about 4 months of happiness. But then, Laura began spending more and more time in Lexington. Initially, she would stay an extra day after our weekend visits, but those extra days soon turned into the majority of the week. By the end of the year, she was practically living with her parents. I would visit on weekends, and one Friday, I arrived early, only to find that Laura wasn't home. Her parents were surprised by my early arrival, as I had finished work earlier than usual. I was about to take my overnight bag to her room when Laura's mother stopped me. "Let me tidy up first," she offered. "It's fine," I said, walking past her. Her room was a disaster. Dirty clothes were scattered everywhere, and the bed was piled with laundry, clearly unused for days. It was obvious she hadn't slept there for a few nights. As Laura's mother hurriedly picked up clothes, I noticed a pair of underwear half hidden under the bed. When I asked her to leave the room under the pretense of needing to use the bathroom, I retrieved the underwear, finding 2 more pairs, one stained with a suspicious substance. I couldn't bring myself to verify the stain, so I took the underwear to the living room and confronted her mother. "How long has she been seeing other men?" I asked, holding up the underwear. "I think that's something you should discuss with her," her mother replied. Without further words, I packed my bag, stuffing the underwear into a side pocket, and left. I drove straight to Margaret's house. Although Margaret and Laura's brother had broken up years ago, they remained friends, and Ruth was now married to Kyle Mitchell, a local business owner. After a brief call, Margaret told me where to find her hidden key, as she was working late. When I arrived at Margaret's house, I called Laura, but she didn't answer, so I left a message. "This is your husband, the only man you're supposed to be with. I need an explanation for why that's no longer true. I also want to know how many others there have been, and why." Kyle arrived home around 8 p.m., and I filled him in on what had happened. Later that night, Margaret called, letting me know that Laura's brother had heard she was out drinking and flirting with several men at a local bar. He had planned to pick her up, but Margaret told him not to worry. I would handle it. When I finally dropped Laura off at her parents' house, both her parents were present. Her mother immediately started blaming me for everything, saying it was my fault for taking her to Italy, where she learned to drink and stray from her upbringing. I glanced at them briefly before walking out and returning to Margaret's house. The three of us talked late into the night about what had happened, and I spent the night on their couch. The next morning, after a cup of coffee, I sat on their porch, gathering my thoughts before the inevitable conversation with Laura. Margaret and Kyle joined me, pressing to know what my plans were, but I had no clear answers. Late in the morning, I drove back to Laura's parents' house. Her father let me in, and I found Laura on the sofa, sipping coffee. Without a word, I placed the stained underwear on the coffee table in front of her. She glanced at them, threw them aside, and took another sip of her coffee. "Why?" I asked. Before she could respond, her mother interjected, "You don't need to answer that, sweetie."
Stay out of this, I snapped. Why? I repeated.
Laura looked up at me and said, "I needed to feel loved, and you weren't around." "How many times have you cheated on me?" I pressed. "I don't know," she replied. "Take a guess," I urged. "Maybe a couple dozen times," she said hesitantly. "With how many different men?" I asked. "I'm not sure," she responded. "Guess," I insisted. 6 or 7, maybe 10. I really don't know. "Does our marriage mean anything to you?" I asked, staring at her as she took another sip of coffee without answering. I left the house without another word, and returned to Margaret's place, telling them what had happened. "Did she show any remorse?" Margaret asked. "None," I replied. "She's cold-hearted." With no reason to stay in Lexington, I decided to return to Fort Knox. On Sunday afternoon, I was surprised when Laura showed up at our house. I was lying on the couch when she came in, sitting on the armrest by my feet. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. "I'm sorry. Don't say another word. If the only excuse you have for cheating is that I wasn't around, that's pathetic. You deliberately stayed away from home so I couldn't be there for you. Instead of coming home, you chose to get drunk and sleep with strangers. That's no excuse to ruin a marriage. Your parents are just as much to blame for enabling your behavior. The only thing left for you to do is pack your things and leave." "I don't want to leave. I've apologized and promised it won't happen again," she pleaded. "I don't care. To me, we're no longer married, so do whatever you want with whoever you want. All I care about now is you leaving," I said, picking up the remote and turning on the TV. She snatched the remote from my hand and hit the mute button. "I'm not leaving. You're my husband, and this is my house," she declared, throwing the remote back at me before walking out to the kitchen to prepare dinner. I made myself a sandwich and ate it in the living room while she stayed in the kitchen. That night, after showering and going to bed, she followed, trying to snuggle up to me. I turned away from her. "Do you honestly think I would be with you after you've been with 6 or 7 or 10 other men?" I apologized, she said. "And you think that makes everything okay?" "Yes. You really need help. I can't stop you from sleeping in this bed, but I don't have to stay here thinking about all those other men being with you," I said, getting up and going to sleep on the couch. The next morning, I ignored her, took a shower, and went to work. After checking in, I spoke with my commanding officer and updated him on the situation. He advised, "If I were you, my first move would be to see an attorney. Take all the time you need." That day, I consulted with several lawyers before choosing one. Mr. Kenneth Riddick, a retired military lawyer who understood the unique challenges faced by soldiers. He asked what I needed from him. "I need your advice because I'm completely lost," I replied. "Are you interested in saving your marriage?" he inquired. "No," I said firmly. "Why not?" "Because she cheated, and I can't accept that in a marriage." "How do you know she was unfaithful?" he asked. I explained the situation to him. "That kind of information doesn't hold much weight in court," he said. "She could claim anything and deny it later unless you have concrete evidence." After a pause, he continued. "So, since you don't want to save the marriage, I'm guessing you're looking for a divorce. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," I answered. "And you probably want to make things difficult for her, right?" "Yes, sir." "Great. I appreciate when clients agree with me. It reinforces what I already know." "And what's that?" I asked. "That I'm a smart son of a gun," he said with a grin, and we both laughed. "Here's my advice," he continued. "If she's living with you, give her the cold shoulder. Ignore her, no matter how much she yells or throws things. Hopefully, she'll decide to leave, either to go back to her mother, her boyfriend, or somewhere else. When she's gone, she'll probably return to her old ways and find someone new. We just need someone to record it. Even if we can't use the video in court, it will show that you're telling the truth about her infidelity. I'm confident the court will rule in your favor. The downside is that we need someone available around the clock to film her activities, which won't be cheap, but it will benefit you in the long run. Are you on board with this?" "Absolutely," I replied. "Good. First, write a check for my fee, and then another for the private investigator I'll arrange for you." Although I felt reassured, I also felt poorer when I returned to my office that evening. Laura called, but following Kenneth Riddick's advice, I didn't pick up. When I got home after 11 p.m., Laura was there waiting for me.
How long is this going to continue? I've apologized. Let's just go back to our normal life, she pleaded.
Ignoring her, I headed straight for the shower. 20 minutes later, as I settled into bed, I heard her car drive away. Getting up, I checked our shared closet and saw that most of her clothes were missing. I went back to bed and fell asleep. The next morning, I contacted Kenneth and informed him that Laura had left, likely heading back to Lexington.
Excellent. I have connections there.
Do you know where she might be staying? He asked. I gave him her parents' address. Perfect, let's proceed, he said. Less than a week later, I received a video showing her with 2 men within 36 hours of leaving. The footage was undeniable. Within 2 days, she was served with divorce papers citing adultery. Less than an hour after receiving them, she called me, crying and begging for forgiveness. I ended the call without saying a word. I kept my boss updated on the situation. He had gone through something similar years ago. The key difference was that his wife cheated on him while he was deployed in a combat zone, which was a far worse betrayal. Next, I informed Post Housing that I was vacating the quarters. The following day, I moved into temporary housing on base. 3 days later, Laura called, saying she couldn't get into the house. I told her it was no longer our home. I had moved out because she had abandoned me, and as a single officer I wasn't entitled to military housing anymore. But we're still married, she protested. I chuckled and ended the call. I figured she'd probably head back to Lexington. As I've mentioned before, I don't drink alcohol. Growing up Lutheran, I never developed a taste for it, and that didn't change as an adult. The same goes for swearing. Though I don't mind if others do, it's just not my thing. I've never been into partying, and seeing women in revealing clothes is not something I usually indulge in. However, that night, I used every swear word I knew, and probably invented a few new ones, as I watched the video of my wife with 2 men. The video started with her dancing on a crowded floor with 2 men. They were behaving in ways meant for private spaces, like bedrooms. She was occupied with both men, using one hand on each of their pants. The scene continued for several minutes before they left the dance floor, exited the building, and got into a car. The detective followed them to a seedy motel. After circling the area, he found their room with the window open, and they didn't seem to care about being seen. Watching my wife undress in front of 2 men felt like a surreal nightmare. Initially, I thought she might be drunk, but her words didn't suggest she was. Come on, guys. Show me what you've got. I've never done this with 2 at once. It should be interesting, she said. It will be, one of the men replied. You'll have more guys in and out of you than you could ever imagine. Don't call me that, she replied. The other man grabbed her hair and yanked her head back. You're a slut, and we'll call you that. She was pulled toward the bed, and what followed was something I'll never forget. The scene played out like something from a terrible movie, but it was real, and it was my wife. I finally paused the video and shut down my computer, feeling overwhelmed. Her behavior was beyond rational explanation. She claimed that her need for love drove her to cheat, but that excuse seemed weak and insincere. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny what she had done. Her parents likely knew about the underwear I found, and they could guess what it meant. That week at work was a relief. Being busy helped distract me from the disturbing memories of the video. On Friday, Kenneth called to inform me that we had a meeting scheduled with Laura and her attorney on Monday. When I arrived, Laura was accompanied by her parents. I asked Kenneth to suggest that her parents not be present for the graphic video we planned to show. Kenneth conveyed this to her lawyer, and I saw him discussing it with Laura and her parents. Laura was visibly upset, shaking her head in disagreement. I don't believe them, she said defiantly. It was clear that all pretense was gone, and as Kenneth had put it, game on. The process moved quickly. Laura's attorney requested that the adultery claim be dropped and replaced with a charge of emotional cruelty. He argued that I had caused her so much emotional pain that she could no longer be around me, which supposedly justified her staying almost exclusively with her parents. Kenneth and I exchanged glances, and I set up my laptop with the video queued to the moment I had paused it. Laura, are you sure you want your parents to see this? I asked.
See what? Me holding hands with someone? Go ahead, show your worst, she sneered.
I pressed play, and the entire room watched in stunned silence. Stop it! Oh my God, stop! Laura shouted as the video played. Her mother fainted, while her father tried to revive her, glaring at Laura with anger. Once her mother regained consciousness, her father addressed Laura with a stern look. I want you out of our house today, he declared. The revelation of her actions had changed their perspective drastically. He helped his wife up and began to leave the room. Pausing at the door, he turned to me and said, You didn't have to go that far, you know. Would you have believed me otherwise? I asked. Probably not, but surely there was a better way, he replied. There was. Your daughter shouldn't have cheated, I answered. After that encounter, I never heard from them again. When it came time for the court date, neither Laura nor her lawyer showed up. 5 weeks later, I was officially divorced, retained all our modest assets, and didn't have to pay any alimony. Another 5 weeks later, I received orders to deploy to a conflict zone in North Africa. Before leaving, I spent a couple of days with Margaret and her husband, then returned home to visit my parents and siblings. I left my car at my parents' house for my father to use while I was away. Matthew was busy with another tour, and my other siblings were still living in Springfield, both married with children. My year in North Africa passed with a few difficult memories. Upon returning, I was promoted to captain, which was a nice boost. My next assignment sent me to Fort Belvoir in Virginia, where I was given command of a garrison. This was a prestigious position for any captain, but being assigned there as a relatively inexperienced officer seemed like a mistake. I even called the assignment office in Washington, D.C. to double-check. "Captain Grant, are you complaining?" the officer asked. "Because if you are, there are plenty of other captains eager to take your place." "No, not at all. I'm very content. I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't be reassigned after a few months if someone noticed a mistake," I replied. "Don't worry, Captain Grant. You're assigned here for 3 years, unless, of course, we need you back in North Africa," he added with a laugh. "If that happens, feel free to send one of those other captains you mentioned instead of me," I joked, and we shared a laugh over that. Adjusting to my new role at Fort Belvoir didn't take long. The post had an experienced first sergeant who handled most of the day-to-day operations, which made my job easier. One Saturday, I decided to take my car to the post auto repair shop, where service members could work on their vehicles using the shop's tools and space. I wasn't a professional mechanic, but growing up in the country had given me enough skills to handle basic repairs, like changing my oil. When I arrived at the shop, it wasn't busy, so I started working on my car. The shop had 3 pits for working underneath vehicles, and I was about 10 minutes into my task when another vehicle pulled into the pit next to mine. I didn't pay much attention until I heard a frustrated voice muttering, "Damn this piece of junk." The noise stopped briefly, only to be followed by the sound of a wrench clattering to the concrete floor. "Ow, damn it!" came the voice again. Amused, I decided to offer some help. I tightened the drain plug, climbed out of my pit, and went over to the adjacent one. The person was a woman, wearing coveralls that were a bit too large for her. Her face was smudged with oil, but beneath it, I could tell she was probably quite attractive. "Need some help?" I asked. She glanced at me, spitting out some oil. "Why do you assume I need help? Is it because I'm a woman, and women supposedly can't change their own oil?" "Not exactly," I replied. "It just sounded like you were having a hard time, so I thought I'd offer a hand. I appreciate it, but I'm fine. I know what I'm doing. I just really dislike this car," she said. "All right then. Have a good day," I said, returning to my car. I added the new oil and left, not expecting to see her again. The following week, I received an invitation to a cocktail party hosted by the commanding general. My presence was required as the garrison commander, though I didn't mingle much with the high-ranking generals and colonels stationed at Fort Belvoir. With a soda in hand, I wandered around the event, hoping to find other officers around my age and rank that I could relate to. I wasn't optimistic about meeting anyone, and unsurprisingly, I didn't. After checking my watch, I realized I had about 10 minutes before it would be polite to leave. The backyard seemed like a pleasant spot to pass the time, so I made my way there. Just as I was about to step outside, I overheard a conversation. Anyway, my dad kept insisting that I learn to do things myself in case I ever get stranded, so I decided to change my own oil. It took forever, and I ended up covered in oil from my hair to my fingernails. I even got some in my mouth. I spilled it all over the instruction manual too, making it almost unreadable. But the worst part was when this incredibly good-looking guy offered to help, and I turned him down. If I'd been smart, I would have asked for his name and number. Her group laughed, and then another woman asked, "What do you mean you should have asked for his number? You've never done that before." "I know, but there was something about him, something I can't quite describe. Even though I was frustrated, I felt something special," she admitted. "Wow, he must have been quite impressive," someone else remarked. "I think he was," she said, her voice trailing off. I smiled to myself, realizing she was talking about me. Curious to see what she looked like without the oil on her face, I stepped through the doors onto the patio and scanned the area. To my right, there were 3 women, one of whom met my gaze briefly before I turned and went back inside. It was clear she recognized me. Finding a spot in the corner where I could observe without being noticed, I watched as the 3 women came inside and headed toward the front door. In most military homes, There's a stand by the entrance where visitors leave their calling cards with their name and rank. The women approached the card tray and began sifting through the cards, eventually finding one and huddling around it. They glanced over at me, and I tried my best to blend into the background. However, being the only company-grade officer, second lieutenant, first lieutenant, or captain, among a group of field-grade officers, major and above, made me rather conspicuous. Figuring out which card was mine wouldn't have been too hard since I was in uniform, and the only officer below the rank of major. Additionally, the nameplate on my uniform clearly read Grant. Debating whether to approach her and mention her car, which would reveal my identity, or wait and see how things unfolded, I decided to hold off. I hadn't been on a real date in ages and was eager for a connection, but patience seemed like the better option. When I felt it was the right moment, I made my way to the hostess, Mrs. Patricia McDonald, and thanked her for the evening. Then I retrieved my hat from the table, where it was easy to spot since it was the only one without a gold braid on the bill. Several times I discreetly glanced at the three women, who were equally discreetly observing me. The intriguing woman and I now had two things in common: the general's party and the auto repair shop. I couldn't linger at the general's house hoping she might appear, but I could certainly hang out at the shop. The next Saturday morning, I was busy washing and waxing my car at the shop. I was nearly finished when I spotted her car pulling into the parking lot. This time she was dressed in jeans and a white blouse with a delicate floral pattern. My car was inside the building, while she parked outside. As she got out of her car and walked toward the shop, a man I recognized as Major David Carmichael from Post Operations approached her. It seemed she was trying to escape the conversation, but he kept her engaged. Our eyes met for a brief second before I looked away. Since I was done, and there were others waiting for my spot, I had to leave. Her gaze lingered on me as I got into my car and drove off. But instead of heading straight home, I pulled over to the side of the road and waited. Within a few minutes, I saw her driving quickly in my direction. I resumed driving, this time heading to the post exchange, PX, which was similar to a small department store. The parking lot was crowded, so I had to park quite far from the entrance. Reserved spaces near the door included one marked for the commanding general, and I noticed her car was parked there. For a moment, I considered going home instead, but I decided against it. As I entered the PX, she was standing just inside the door. "Playing hard to get?" she asked with a smile. "No, ma'am. Are you trying to get me?" I replied, grinning. She burst out laughing. "That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. Can you actually be won over?" I teased. "Probably, but I'm not exactly easy," she said, pointing toward the snack stand down the hallway. "Would a soda be enough?" I chuckled. "As long as you don't expect too much." At the snack stand, we each got a soda. Hers was diet, and she paid for both. We found a table and ended up talking for nearly 3 hours without realizing it. Her phone rang multiple times, but she ignored each call. Finally, she checked her watch and jumped up. "Oh no, I have a date. I need to go," she said, standing up. "Now who's being elusive?" I asked. We walked to her car, and she drove off to meet her date. Having not had a good meal in a while, I decided to head to the officers' club, where the prime rib was known to be outstanding. After eating, I planned to relax at my temporary quarters. When I arrived at the club, I discovered the dining room was closed for a private event, but the grill was open, so I decided to eat there. After finishing my meal, I started to leave, but something caught my attention in the dining room. There, in the doorway, dancing closely together, were Major Carmichael and the woman I had just spent the afternoon with. I realized with a shock that I still didn't know her name, despite all our conversation. I stayed and watched them dance until they were jostled by another couple, and she looked over at me. Quickly, I turned and headed for the exit. Since the quarters were a short walk away, I made my way there. The lobby had 2 large TVs, a bar, and a snack table frequently stocked by the officers' club. I settled in, grabbed a soda, and watched a rerun of a NASCAR race. After about 2 hours, I was ready to head to my room when Major Carmichael walked in. He grabbed a drink and took a seat near me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, striking up a conversation about the race. Then casually he asked, "Aren't you the garrison commander?" "Yes, I am," I replied, shaking his hand. "Stephen Grant." "David Carmichael, from Post Operations," he introduced himself. We chatted for a while, and David was easy to get along with. After a bit, I mentioned, "I saw you dancing earlier at the club. Your date seemed familiar." He laughed. "That's because she is. She's the commanding general's daughter, Elizabeth McDonald." "Just curious, but is there anything between you?" "Two?" I asked. He chuckled. "No way. Nobody gets close to Miss Ice Queen. I've gone out with her a few times, but every time I think we're making progress, she shuts me down." "Why do you keep trying then?" I inquired. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm hoping she'll warm up, or maybe I just enjoy the challenge, he said, glancing at me. Funny you asked about her, though. She saw you tonight and asked if I knew who you were. He laughed again. I didn't want to deal with more competition, so I told her I had no idea. David Carmichael and I ended up becoming friends. 3 days later, Elizabeth MacDonald called and invited me to dinner. I agreed, feeling surprised and intrigued. That evening, while sitting in the quarters lobby, David joined me again. He looked at me with a knowing smile and said, I hear you've got a date with Elizabeth. Yes, Friday night. How did you find out? I called her to ask her out, and she told me right away that she had a date with you, he replied. By the way, is it with who or with whom? Honestly, I was surprised myself, I said. She's usually pretty private with her phone number. Mind sharing how you got it? I don't have it. She never gave it to me, I explained. So how did you set up the date? You can't just show up at her door, he said, curious. I didn't actually ask her. She called me, I admitted. I hadn't really thought about how she got my number. She must have used the calling card I left at the general's place and had access to the post telephone directory. Simple as that. David stared at me for a moment and then burst out laughing. Well, I'll be darned. I've known her for nearly 3 years, and she's never asked a guy out before. You must be something special. I wouldn't go that far, I said. Let me tell you something, David continued. Elizabeth does date, but it's rare. Since I've been around, she's only gone out with me and 2 other guys. We're a tight-knit group, and we keep tabs on each other, hoping one of us will make some headway. So far, all she's shared are a few slow dances and a couple of pecks on the cheek. We continued chatting, and as I mentioned before, David and I had become friends. He genuinely wished me luck with Elizabeth. Just keep me posted, and I'll make sure the other 2 guys know how things are going with you, he said with a grin. Our dinner dates went well. In fact, they went so well that I kept asking her out, and she kept saying yes. David eventually found out he was being transferred to Germany and invited Elizabeth for a farewell dinner. She turned him down, saying, I really like Stephen David. I like him a lot, and I don't want to mess things up. I always picked Elizabeth up at her house for our dates, so I had plenty of interactions with both her parents. They didn't seem to dislike me, but they weren't exactly warm or welcoming either. After dating Elizabeth for about 7 months, I managed to reach what you might call second base, which for us meant holding hands and exchanging kisses. She mentioned that no one else had ever gotten that far with her. In the 8th month of our relationship, I received orders to return to North Africa. I called my branch to confirm, feeling confused. I thought I was on a 3-year stable assignment, I told the assignment manager. You were, Stephen, but something must have gone wrong because we've been instructed to reassign you immediately. You need to be in the country in 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks? That's really short notice. Everyone usually gets at least 30 days, I replied, feeling frustrated. I reached out to Elizabeth, and she was even more distressed than I was. After talking for a while, she ended the call by saying, I love you, Stephen. It was the first time she had ever said those words. The next evening I was packed and set to leave the following morning when I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find Elizabeth standing there. She stepped into my embrace and we shared a kiss. My father did this, she said abruptly. Did what exactly? I asked. He's the reason you're being shipped out, she said. Why would he do that? He knows how much I care about you, I replied. He's afraid of losing me, she explained. Eventually he will lose me to someone, whether it's you or another person. What do you mean by someone else? There's no one else right now, right? I asked, feeling a pang of concern. There will be if I don't come back, she said, holding me tighter. Don't talk like that, I said, pulling her closer. Then she pulled away slightly and looked at me seriously. Marry me. What are you talking about? I asked, surprised. Marry me. That will really get under his skin, she said with a mischievous smile. I chuckled. Marrying me just to upset your father isn't a good reason to get married. She released me and sat down in a chair. Then I'll just stay here tonight. That would really drive him crazy. I laughed again. I'd love for you to stay, but after fighting with your father, where do you think the MPs will look first if you don't come home? Then let's go to a motel off post, she suggested. I knelt in front of her. I love you too much to have our first night together be about revenge or hiding. It should be a moment we're proud of and want to share with the world. She cupped my face, kissed me, and laughed. I've already done that. Everyone at Fort Belvoir knows I love you, especially my father. That's why he had you reassigned. As we sat close together in the chair, the temptation was strong. It had been a long time since I had been with anyone, and here was a woman I deeply cared about. But I wanted our first time together to be special, and this didn't feel right. Our kissing was interrupted when her phone rang. Hello, Mom, she said, putting the call on speaker.
Where are you? Her mother's voice demanded.
At the quarters with Stephen, Elizabeth replied. When are you coming home? Her mother asked. Not until Stephen leaves tomorrow, she answered. glancing at me with a smile. Her mother gasped. You know your father will be furious, don't you? He's already done his worst, Mom. Having Stephen transferred was his way of hurting us, she said. What should I tell him? Her mother asked, sounding worried. Tell him that I'm an adult and I'll make my own decisions. Goodbye, Mother. You realize that the MPs are probably on their way by now, I said after the call ended. I don't care, she replied. That's easy for you to say since you'll just go home. But I'll be the one facing jail time, I pointed out. She threw herself into my arms and we embraced and kissed passionately for a long time. Then she gazed deeply into my eyes. I love you, Stephen. You know that. I've never been in love before, she said, her voice softening. I know, I replied. And I'm aware that you love me too, she continued. Would you like to hear how I know? Yes, I answered. Aside from the times we've kissed, you haven't tried to go any further. That shows me you respect me and aren't rushing things. We both understand that it will eventually happen, and when it does, it will be special, she said, starting to unbutton her blouse. Once it was fully unbuttoned, she slid it off and reached behind her back to unclasp her bra, removing it without hesitation. Pulling me closer, she guided my head toward her. I've only touched you before, I said, but never kissed you there. No one has ever done this before, she sighed, breathless. I want you to remember this and come back for more. I kissed and gently caressed her until I finally pulled away. We need to stop now, or we won't be able to stop at all, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I understand, but I didn't realize it would feel this amazing, she replied, catching her breath. She put her blouse back on but left her bra off. Just remember that these are mine. No one else should see or touch them, she said with a smile, kissing me again. Standing up, she picked up her bra and walked over to my duffel bag. Since I hadn't zipped it up yet, she carefully folded her bra and placed it inside. After one last look at me, she left, tears streaming down her face. The next morning I was waiting for Major General MacDonald when he arrived at his headquarters. I was there to open the door for him when his driver pulled up. He seemed surprised to see me, though he knew who I was. Why are you here, Captain? He asked, his tone stern. I'm here to tell you exactly what kind of a cowardly father I think you are, I said, my voice steady. Sure, you might be a good general, but as a parent, you're failing miserably. You can send me anywhere you want, even to a federal penitentiary. But I'm going to speak my mind. I continued. I care deeply for your daughter, and she says she loves me too. That might be new to you because if I'm reading the situation right, she's never been in love before, and that terrifies you. You're worried that one day you'll lose her to another man. It could be me, David Carmichael, a private in boot camp, or some civilian doctor. But eventually, she'll leave. And I hope it hurts you as much as you've hurt her by using your influence to have me transferred. When you see her at dinner tonight, I want you to remember that you've broken her heart. You've caused her pain. She might forget about me over time, which I'm sure is what you want, but she will fall in love again. And each time she does, you'll lose a piece of her until you're left with nothing but her hatred. I didn't even give him a salute as I walked away. I fully expected to be stopped, detained, and thrown in jail as I left the post, but none of that happened. Instead, I drove to my sister Margaret's house, then on to visit my parents. I planned to leave my car with them while I was away, and I packed my few personal belongings into storage. During my visit with Margaret, she filled me in on what had happened with my ex-wife. Apparently, she had spiraled out of control after our divorce, turning to stripping and selling herself to support her habits. Her parents disowned her after seeing the video of her with 2 men, and never spoke to her again. Even her own brother, who had once been close to her, cut ties with her. She had been arrested multiple times for solicitation and drug possession, and was currently in jail. After spending 3 days with my parents, I spoke with Elizabeth multiple times before I left. I learned that on the day I departed from Fort Belvoir, she moved out of her parents' house and into a furnished apartment in town, which really upset her father. She refused to talk to him, and according to her mother, he was torn between anger and hurt. When I arrived at the departure point and checked in, the sergeant behind the counter reviewed my orders, then excused himself to consult with someone in the office behind him. A few minutes later, he came back with a first lieutenant. Captain Grant, can you step into my office for a moment? The lieutenant asked. I followed him into his office. Please have a seat, Captain, he said, pausing to gather his thoughts. Your orders have been revised. It appears the original orders were issued by mistake. Fort Belvoir is investigating the issue, but here are your new instructions. You are to return to Fort Belvoir and resume your previous duties. He threw up his hands in disbelief. I've seen orders changed before, but never where a service member is reassigned back to their old position. On top of that, we received this yesterday by personal courier, specifically to be delivered to you. The lieutenant handed me a sealed envelope with the return address of the commanding general, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Congratulations, Captain. You're going back home, the lieutenant said. Stepping outside, I opened the envelope. Inside was a brief note that simply read, "You were right." It was signed by Major General MacDonald. I quickly called Elizabeth, and she picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice full of anticipation. "I'm heading home. Did you know they canceled my orders?" I replied.
No way! What happened? She exclaimed.
"Seems like your father had a change of heart. I'm going back to Fort Belvoir," I explained. "Oh my God, how soon can you get here?" she asked, her excitement palpable. "In a couple of days. I need to pick up my car first, then I'll drive from there," I said. "Come quickly, sweetheart. I'll start looking for a bigger apartment," she said, her voice full of joy. I made record time on my way back. We stayed on the phone for the last 100 miles, and she rushed out to meet me as I turned onto the street where her apartment was. The car had barely stopped when I jumped out and into her arms. We kissed and hugged, oblivious to the traffic weaving around us. Military towns are used to these emotional reunions happening in unusual spots. After a few minutes, we managed to calm down and head inside, where we continued to kiss and embrace. Once we had settled down from the initial excitement, we sat together on her sofa and talked. She had spoken with her mother, but not with her father yet. Her mother didn't know about the change in my orders, but seemed genuinely pleased for her daughter when she found out. I showed Elizabeth the brief note I received from her father. "What does this mean?" she asked, looking at the note. I explained what happened when I met him the morning I left. "I'm amazed he didn't have you arrested for speaking to him like that," she said, shaking her head. "Me too," I agreed. "I bet it went against everything he believes in to change your orders," she said. "He didn't do it for me. He did it for you because he loves you and is struggling to accept that he's no longer the only man in your life," I replied. Her gaze was filled with love as she looked at me. I looked back at her, stood up, and pulled out the ring I had bought in Kentucky when I picked up my car. Kneeling down, I held out the ring. Before I could say anything, she started crying. "Elizabeth Ann MacDonald, will you marry me?" Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees, extended her left hand, and said, "Put it on my finger." Once the ring was on her finger, she responded, "Yes, Stephen Grant. I will marry you and love you until the day I die." The kiss we shared was transformative. It resonated deeply within me, and I felt certain that I would spend the rest of my life loving her. Every man believes his partner is the most beautiful and perfect, and I was no exception. I suggested we stay at a luxury hotel for our first night together, but she declined. "This apartment is our first home. I want our first night to be in our first home," she said, smiling at me. She had arranged everything for my return, doing it in her own special way. For our first meal in the apartment, we enjoyed champagne, pâté, and chocolate-covered strawberries. I even had some of the champagne, which was a rare occurrence for me. Elizabeth wanted to enjoy a bubble bath before the evening truly began. After her bath, she emerged wearing a deep red lace outfit that included matching underwear and a robe that perfectly complemented the ensemble. As she went about opening the champagne and arranging the pâté, I took a quick shower. When I entered the bedroom, I wore nothing but a bathrobe. We settled on the bed to eat and drink. Every now and then, we shared kisses, which grew more passionate as the evening progressed. Gradually, the food was set aside, and our kisses became more intense until the tray was completely forgotten. Standing next to the bed, she undid the belt of my bathrobe. Holding the robe closed, she gazed into my eyes. "This is the first time I've ever undressed a man, Stephen. I always wanted it to be with the one I truly love, and that's you. People call me an ice queen, but I promise to be the best lover I can be when you want me to be," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. She gazed up at me, her eyes full of desire. "It's beautiful, Stephen, and it's all mine. I've heard about women doing things, but I never imagined doing it myself. Now I can't wait." She started moving her hips, matching the rhythm as we became one. It was hard to believe that someone Elizabeth's age could still be so innocent, but witnessing her youthful enthusiasm was both exciting and endearing. By the time we were finished, it was early morning. Her phone woke us up a few hours later. "Hello, Mother," she said brightly, putting the call on speaker as she usually did. "Good morning. Have you heard from Stephen? Shouldn't he be back today?" her mother asked. She flashed a wide smile at me. "He came home yesterday and stayed with me overnight, Mother." Her mother's voice brightened. "Oh, really? That's wonderful news. He proposed to me and I said yes," Elizabeth continued. Her mother's excitement was evident. "That's fantastic. When are you planning the wedding?" Elizabeth chuckled. "We haven't set a date yet. We were thinking we'd talk about it with you and Dad at dinner tonight. Does that work for you?" Surprised by this news, I just stared at Elizabeth, feeling a bit bewildered. She noticed and winked at me. "That sounds great. What kind of wine does Stephen like?" her mother asked. "He doesn't usually drink, but he'll have a bit of champagne with us," Elizabeth replied.
Perfect. We'll see both of you at 7 o'clock. Does that work for you?
That's ideal. See you then. Should I tell Dad about the engagement, or would you prefer to do it? Her mother asked. You can tell him if you think he'll take it well. Otherwise, we can have Stephen do it, Elizabeth said. After ending the call, Elizabeth looked at me and said, Make sure to take care. Of me, fiancé. It was a request I was always happy to fulfill. We arrived right at 7 o'clock and rang the doorbell. Her father answered. Why are you ringing the bell? You have a key, he said to Elizabeth. I know, but I don't live here anymore, Daddy, she replied. I saw him flinch slightly, but his mood lifted when Elizabeth hugged him and kissed him on the cheek. I heard her whisper a thank you as she kissed him. This was clearly going to be a tough conversation for him. He extended his hand for a handshake, which I took. Dinner is ready, so let's get started, he said. We were shown into the small family dining room rather than the formal dining area. Elizabeth and I took our seats on opposite sides of the table, and champagne was already poured.
Daddy, Mom, Stephen has something he wants to share, Elizabeth announced.
I took a deep breath and began. First, General MacDonald, I want to express my gratitude for your help in getting my orders changed. I phrased it that way, fully aware that he was responsible for both the original orders and their reversal. Secondly, General MacDonald, Mrs. MacDonald, I want you to know that I love your daughter and have asked her to marry me. And I accepted, Elizabeth said, extending her hand first to her mother and then to her father. Her mother was overjoyed and beamed with happiness. Her father, clearly instructed to handle the situation gracefully, managed to maintain his composure and even proposed a toast. After the meal, Elizabeth and her mother left to start planning the wedding, while the general and I went to the library, where he poured us each a glass of port. I know you only drink on special occasions, and it looks like tonight qualifies as one, he said, handing me the glass. Congratulations, Stephen. You've achieved something I hoped I wouldn't see. After taking a sip, he motioned for us to sit. I always expected this would happen eventually, but he shifted his tone as he continued. You were right about me. I thought I knew what was best for my daughter, but seeing the way she looked at you during dinner made me realize how wrong I was. My only request is that you take care of her and love her forever, just as you do now. You can count on that, sir. I would never do anything to hurt her, I assured him. I believe you, he replied. However, there's one issue I'm struggling with. What's that, sir? I asked. I'm not comfortable with the idea of you two living together before the wedding, he admitted. It was clear Elizabeth's mother had mentioned this to him. There's not much room for negotiation on that, sir, I said, understanding the delicate situation. I figured as much, but I thought I should at least mention it, he said with a sigh. 6 months after that dinner, Elizabeth's father retired and took on a new role as the CEO of a major auto parts division. 2 months later, Elizabeth and I were married. She was visibly pregnant as she walked down the aisle. My brother Matthew made an appearance with his band and even performed an unexpected song at our reception. He also gifted Elizabeth's parents with a special edition of his latest album. The day after we returned from our honeymoon, David Carmichael gave me a call. He congratulated me and mentioned that he had won $500 from the other 2 guys who had dated Elizabeth. They had bet him that I would mess things up like they did, but David disagreed and ended up making some money. 2 months after the wedding, we welcomed our son, Alexander James Grant. 6 months later, I decided to leave the military and started working for my father-in-law. From the moment he could walk, Alexander became very close to his grandfather. They were practically inseparable, and my father-in-law often felt a bit jealous when we visited my parents with Alexander. During one of our trips to Kentucky, my sister Margaret updated me on my ex-wife's life. Her career had spiraled downward after being caught mailing some illegal substances. The federal authorities don't tolerate that, so now she's facing a prison sentence of 5 to 7 years. One weekend, while Alexander was at his grandparents' lake house, Elizabeth and I had the house to ourselves. We were cuddled up on the sofa, watching a movie, when she turned to me and asked, Stephen? Yes, I replied. Do you enjoy being a father? Absolutely. Why do you ask? I responded. Would you want to have another child? She asked, her tone hopeful. I leaned back and studied her face. Are you trying to tell me you're pregnant? She placed her hand on my lap and started rubbing it gently. No, but I would like to be. I took a moment to process Elizabeth's words, feeling a surge of warmth and excitement. I reached out, taking her hand in mine as I gazed into her eyes. Are you serious? I asked, my voice barely containing the mix of surprise and joy. Yes, I am, she replied with a soft smile. Alexander is growing up so fast, and I've been thinking a lot about having another baby. I love being a mother, and I know you're a great father. It just feels like the right time. I squeezed her hand, feeling a deep sense of contentment. I'd love to have another child with you, Elizabeth, I said sincerely. Alexander would make a great big brother. Her smile widened and she leaned in to kiss me. I'm so happy to hear that, she whispered against my lips. I've been nervous about bringing it up, but now that we've talked about it, I feel even more sure. We spent the rest of the evening discussing our hopes and dreams for expanding our family. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and the more we talked, the more excited we became about the prospect of adding another member to our little family. We reminisced about the early days with Alexander, from his first steps to his first words, and imagined what it would be like to go through all those precious moments again. The next morning, Elizabeth was already making plans. Over breakfast, she started brainstorming names, nursery themes, and even talked about converting the guest room into a new nursery. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself getting swept up in her excitement. I think we should start trying soon, she suggested, sipping her coffee. Maybe even tonight? Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she said it. I couldn't help but laugh. You don't waste any time, do you? Not when it comes to something this important, she replied, grinning. That evening, after putting Alexander to bed, we dimmed the lights and set the mood in our bedroom. Elizabeth had put on a favorite song of ours, and we danced together, swaying slowly to the music. As the song played, I couldn't help but feel that we were at the beginning of something truly special. Our desire for another child brought us closer together in the following weeks. Every shared glance, every touch, seemed to carry a deeper meaning, as if we were both acutely aware of the life we were hoping to create. It was an exciting, hopeful time, filled with anticipation and love. A few months later, we were sitting in the doctor's office, holding hands as we waited for the results of Elizabeth's pregnancy test. The seconds felt like hours, but finally the doctor returned with a broad smile on her face. Congratulations, Elizabeth. You're pregnant, she announced. Tears of joy welled up in Elizabeth's eyes as she squeezed my hand. We did it, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. I kissed her forehead, feeling a swell of pride and happiness. Yes, we did. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and celebrations. We told our families the good news, and everyone was thrilled. Alexander, though still young, seemed excited about becoming a big brother. He would often pat Elizabeth's growing belly and ask questions about the baby. Is it a boy or a girl? He'd ask, his eyes wide with curiosity. We don't know yet, buddy, I'd reply, ruffling his hair. But you'll be the best big brother either way. As Elizabeth's due date approached, we put the finishing touches on the nursery, making sure everything was perfect for the new arrival. The room was painted a soft, calming shade of green, with a crib set up near the window. We filled it with baby clothes, toys, and all the little things that would soon be needed. One evening, after tucking Alexander into bed, Elizabeth and I sat together in the nursery, admiring our work. It's hard to believe we'll have another little one in here soon, she said, resting her hand on her belly. I know, I agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. It feels like just yesterday we were doing this for Alexander. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I'm so glad we decided to have another baby, Stephen. I can't wait to meet them. Me too, I said, pressing a kiss to her temple. It's going to be amazing. A few weeks later, in the middle of the night, Elizabeth gently shook me awake. Stephen, it's time, she said, her voice calm but urgent. I bolted upright, fully awake in an instant. Are you sure? She nodded, wincing slightly as another contraction hit. We need to go to the hospital. I quickly helped her out of bed, grabbed the packed overnight bag we had ready, and called my sister Margaret to come stay with Alexander. Within minutes, we were on our way to the hospital, excitement and nerves bubbling in equal measure. The labor was long but smooth. Elizabeth was incredible throughout, her strength and determination inspiring me all over again. Finally, after hours of hard work, our baby was born, a beautiful, healthy little girl. As I held her in my arms for the first time, I was overwhelmed with love and gratitude. She was perfect, with a head full of dark hair and tiny, delicate fingers that wrapped around mine. Elizabeth looked up at me, exhausted but radiant, and smiled. What should we name her? I asked, my voice choked with emotion. Elizabeth thought for a moment, then said, How about Lily? Lily Grant, I repeated, testing the name. It felt right, like it had always been meant for her. It's perfect. Our lives quickly adjusted to the rhythms of having a newborn in the house again. Alexander was fascinated by his baby sister, often peeking into her crib and asking to hold her. Seeing him interact with Lily filled my heart with pride and joy. The bond between them was already strong, and I knew it would only grow as they got older. As the months passed, our family settled into a new routine. We navigated the challenges and joys of raising two young children, supporting each other through sleepless nights and celebrating every milestone, big or small. One day, as we were out for a walk in the park, Elizabeth and I watched as Alexander ran ahead, laughing and playing, while I pushed Lily in her stroller. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sounds of children's laughter and birds chirping. Elizabeth slipped her hand into mine, and we shared a look that said everything words couldn't. Our journey together had been full of twists and turns, but in that moment, everything felt right. We had built a life filled with love, and our family was complete.